Have you ever misunderstood a situation so bad and made such a wrong call that it came back on you in a serious fashion? I feel like this happens to me often because many times I am overconfident. I can tend to be overconfident about the decisions that I make or the things that I see. And sometimes it is radically embarrassing because I can read a situation so poorly. Maybe I'm the only one that has ever done that, but I think probably some of you out there have felt that way before. Maybe some of you feel that way right now. That is what's happening in the text today. Today we are looking at 2 Samuel 10 and 1 Chronicles 19. And what's really interesting is it sets up like this giant war. We've seen how God is giving David peace on all sides of the nation of Israel. We see how a lot of nations are being defeated by David's army. Today in our reading, basically like the king of the Ammonites dies. And David wants to basically show concern for the king of the Ammonites. So he sends a group of ambassadors to Hanun. That's the guy's name, Hanun, the son of Nahash. Basically to care for this king, to express loyalty to this king, the new king, because the former king had been kind to David and loyal to David. But what happens is when his delegation gets to this kingdom, the people are nervous because we have seen David defeating a lot of people. We've seen a lot of nations coming under David's authority. And so probably this kingdom was nervous. Probably Hanun's people were nervous about the fact that David had just defeated the Moabites like pretty easily. He's defeated some Syrians. He's defeated other people groups like all around him. And so it makes sense that this kingdom is fearful. But David's intent was never to conquer this nation. David's intent was to basically send a gift and care for the people. But they read the situation completely wrong. Now, obviously, back in that day, diplomatic relationships were handled a little bit differently because what they do is they capture this delegation that David sends and they shave half of their beards off and they cut half of their clothes off and send them home. I think today we do things a little bit differently. But basically what the king, what Hanun is trying to do is show that he is cutting off all diplomatic ties with David's nation because he's embarrassing his ambassadors. So David sees the embarrassment of his ambassadors. He allows them to basically grow back their beards in Jericho, which is kind of funny. But a war ensues, and it's a pretty significant war. You can see that Hanun is bringing up a lot of Syrian kind of mercenaries. You can see that the Ammonites bring about a pretty serious contingent of fighting force. And Israel is in a situation where their army is between two enemies, either from the north or the south or from the east and from the west. They're caught in between. And the way that you see they're caught in between is that when Joab decides to muster up his forces, he basically says to one side of the army, hey, if you need help, our guys will come help you. If we need help, you guys will come help us. It shows us that they are caught in the middle. One of the things that's really interesting is in chapter 10, this is 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 12. Joab is talking to the army, and he says, be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him. So Joab and the people who were with him drew near to battle against the Syrians, and the Syrians fled before him. In this verse, sometimes I think we are kind of like, sometimes we can fall into kind of grasping for application. But today what's interesting in this verse is that Joab is showing us what it means to be faithful to the Lord, but also to put the work in. I feel like we've seen a couple examples where people just pray and pray and pray and they wait for God to act. That is what David has been doing with Saul being the king. But today in the reading, we see the people of God raising up, being willing to act on God's behalf. They're basically saying like, hey, we are going to fight. We are going to defend our people. We're going to be bold. We're going to be courageous. It brings to mind what God had told Joshua to do when he took over the people of Israel. But basically, like, the people stand up and they say, hey, we are willing to fight for this. We're willing to work on behalf of this. But also, we are going to be faithful that God will be with us and God will do what he intends. And so you get this really interesting picture of faith and works going hand in hand. James is going to talk about that exact concept. He's going to say that faith without works is dead. It is meaningless to be full of faith and not show anything that reflects the fact that you're faithful. So what Joab is doing with the army is he's saying, hey, we are going to defend the cities of God. We are going to trust that God will be with us, and we're going to fight these enemies. And as they fight the enemies, God gives them victory over their enemies because God is continuing to give them victory on every side. Now, one thing that is interesting is that this war between the Ammonites and the Syrians and the people of Israel, this is setting up the story of David and Bathsheba. We're going to be jumping into the story of David and Bathsheba in a couple days, actually in 2 days. But that story is cast in the context of this war. It is this war that is being fought when David decides to stay home and is drawn into sin. So we'll be talking about that more in a couple of days. But just to set that up, that is what's happening here. This war is the war that is occurring when David falls into sin, and it's a pretty significant sin. But God is working on behalf of his people, and he is delivering the people from the threat from the Ammonites. What's interesting is this entire threat could have been avoided if the king Hanun would not have rushed into judgment. And so if he would have been wise, if he would have been discerning, if he would have been gracious, if he would have looked at his advisors and said, no, like David is being loyal to me because my father was loyal to him, this entire war could have been avoided. Many lives would not have been lost, and he would still have a kingdom. But because he rushed to judgment, he is punished for that. He comes under the results of his rash action. I think there's a lot to be learned from that. I started out the episode talking about how have you ever made a rash decision or maybe read a situation wrong and paid the consequences? Hanun, the king of the Ammonites, would be in exactly that category. Now, there is an interesting thing to point out about some numbers. If you are an eagle-eyed person, you will notice that 2 Samuel 10:18 says, and the Syrians fled before Israel, and David killed of the Syrians the men of 700 chariots and 40,000 horsemen. Now, if you flip over to 1 Chronicles 19, you can see in verse 18, the Syrians fled before Israel, and David killed the Syrians, the men of 7,000 chariots and 40,000 foot soldiers. So you could read that and you could say, what is going on here? Because there are several thousand more chariots in Chronicles than there are in 2 Samuel. It is not a lie. Basically, what we have here is a scribal error that is still in the text. I've told you guys a couple times that Chronicles is written by the chronicler. The chronicler is working with a couple original documents. There are people actually sitting down and copying these documents into a new book. And when they copy these documents, they copy them incorrectly. It could be that there was an error in the script. It could be that the scribe misunderstood what was being said. At any rate, it doesn't, this is not one of those issues where you can point to the text and be like, they're lying because there's several thousand more chariots in Chronicles than there is in 2 Samuel. This is just a simple error. Unfortunately, the scribe for the chronicler did not have spell check or Grammarly, which would have been nice for him. So this is not a doctrinal crisis. This is just a spelling error, a writing error that has been kept in the text because the translations are true to the original texts. So we can trust them because they keep these kinds of things in there. So that's an interesting side note to catch. The final thing that we read was Psalm 20. And Psalm 20 goes along with the reading really, really well. It's basically highlighting how God fights for his people. So as always with the Psalms, I invite you to go back and read over it for yourself. But it's basically talking about like firm, unflinching faith in the Lord. It's actually called a royal psalm. It's basically lifting up the power of David and his kingdom. That's why it ends with, "O Lord, save the king. May he answer us when we call." But basically, Psalm 20 is lifting up the power of God, how loyal God is to his servant David, how loyal God is to the people of his kingdom. Another interesting thing, I feel like we've been highlighting this a lot, but it says, some trust in chariots. This is verse 7, Psalm 20, verse 7. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. They collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. There is this constant reminder in the Psalms that our hope is not in the defenses that we can build, or the armies we can raise, or the horses we can gather. It's in the God who saves us. And you see this from Joab. Joab is constantly, as leader of the mighty men, saying, God, like, we need you on our side. We want to be faithful to you. We are willing to fight like crazy, but we need you to do what you're going to do. So there's many things here in the text today. There's plenty of your parts. I know yesterday we had a little bit of a your part buffet, so I want to cut back on that some. I would say, after reading this text, it is kind of sad that Hanun basically destroyed his kingdom by making a foolish decision. He assumed the wrong thing about David, even though he was using some reliable information. Basically, David was conquering every kingdom around him, but David did not intend to conquer his kingdom. And so Hanun had these princes around him that were bad counselors. Those bad counselors gave him bad advice. And because of that bad advice, he embarrassed David's ambassadors. He raised an army against David, which ultimately was raising an army against God and God's people. And he paid the price. And so I just encourage you to be gracious in your interactions today. Show mercy in your interactions today, and don't rush to judgment. Man, that is probably one of the things that I fall into so many times. I wish I was not that way, but some of you that listen to the podcast actually know me and know that I can fall into that stuff. So it's my prayer that I am more gracious, that I am more slow to act and slow to judgment. And I don't want to be like Hanun. I don't want to make foolish choices and foolish decisions because I acted too quickly. I want to surround myself with wise counselors. There's actually a few proverbs about that. Surround yourself with wise people. Be slow to act. Be careful when you make decisions. And ultimately ensure that you're honoring God in all things. So we'll be back again tomorrow. We'll be back in the Psalms. So we'll see you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplанyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.